There are cases that are hard to believe even after everything has been proven, and this is one of them. Check this out. When the police officers entered that cramped apartment looking for clues about who had been desecrating the graves in that city, they had no idea they would find a truly macabre scene. The place was filled with dolls, big dolls, the size of a child, sitting on the shelves, leaning against the couch, scattered in the corners among piles of books and old papers. They had colorful little dresses, socks, and makeup on their faces. One of the officers touched one of those dolls and the house out of nowhere filled with music. That apartment held a secret that more than a dozen families in that city would carry for the rest of their lives. And that grotesque and disturbing scene was actually a portrait of what was in the mind of the man who had done all that. Marcos Campos, and today's case comes from Russia. The protagonist was a man considered a kind of genius in his hometown. But this guy did something for years, hidden inside his house, something that no one imagined was possible. There are many questions that this case brings up, like, for example, how did he manage to hide this for so long? And also, what did he actually want with all of that in the end? That's what we're going to investigate in today's episode, along with other things. So, let's get to the facts. The dolls. Let's start with what was inside that apartment when the police arrived and ended up discovering it by chance, in quotes. Those dolls weren't dolls, they were bodies. Bodies of girls who had died, been buried, and then taken out of their own graves. 26 in total was the number that forensics managed to confirm. Even though the first reports from the Russian press, in the heat of the moment, recorded and mentioned 29, most of them were girls, aged between 3 and 12 years old according to the most recent Russian reports, okay? Although some older versions of the case have mentioned slightly different age ranges as well. The man who lived there had dug up these bodies over the years and taken them to his house. But he didn't just leave the remains there the way he found them. He had studied mummification techniques and he dried the bodies with a homemade mixture of salt and baking soda. As the skin and limbs shrank and withered as they dried, he would then wrap the arms and legs in strips of cloth, and he stuffed the torso with rags and padding to give it volume, to make it look like a child's body again. Then came the part that gave it the final appearance. He covered some faces with wax masks. He painted these masks with nail polish to imitate human skin. He put wigs on them, dressed the girls in colorful children's clothes, socks, little boots. In some cases, he even sewed buttons in place of the eyes. According to what he himself said later, the buttons were so they could watch cartoons with him. And remember the song that played when the police officer touched one of them in the opening scene of the episode? That's right, this man would insert objects inside the chest cavity of the bodies. In almost all of them, there was something there in the chest, and in some of them, a music box. The investigators said that when they tried to move one of the bodies, the room suddenly filled with melody out of nowhere. In others, they found toy hearts, pieces of soap, and fragments of tombstones. Man, that's Dearest Abductees. If that's not the script for a grotesque horror movie, I don't know what is. That man lived with those things as if they were his daughters. He talked to them, sang to them, actually watched cartoons, even read stories out loud. He celebrated each one's birthday. Now, the question that's probably already running through your mind is, what kind of person is capable of doing that? And this is where the case gets even harder to swallow. The city. The genius. Now I need to tell you a little about the person behind all of this, someone I can't even name. The man behind this wasn't just some criminal living in the shadows, okay? Maybe it's the opposite of that. His name is Anatoly Moskvin. He was born on September 1st, 1966 in the city that was then called Gorky and is now called Nizhny Novgorod. It's about 400 kilometers east of Moscow, and from an early age, he showed himself to be someone who was intellectually above average. He studied in the field of languages and philology, attending the Gorky Pedagogical Institute of Foreign Languages and later the Faculty of Philology at Moscow State University, where he pursued his postgraduate studies. So he became a linguist, historian, and an expert in Celtic culture and folklore. You know that ancient tradition where the boundary, let's say, between the living and the dead is kind of blurred. And he even taught Celtic studies at the language university in his own city. And the detail that impressed everyone the most was that the guy was a polyglot. He spoke 13 languages, wrote books, dictionaries, translations, all of which were respected in academic circles. He kept a personal library at home with more than 70,000 books and documents. His colleagues described him with two words that usually came together: genius and eccentric. But his personal life was one of almost total isolation. He never married, never dated, didn't drink, didn't smoke, and still lived with his parents. And he had a very specific obsession that he turned into his own professional identity: cemeteries. He called himself a necropolist, which is something like a cemetery specialist. He was widely considered the person who knew the cemeteries in that region the best. To give you an idea of the level of this obsession, in old interviews and reports, Moskvin said he had studied more than 750 cemeteries over about 20 years. There in Nizhny Novgorod, which is his city, and also in other regions of Russia, he turned this into almost his own personal identity. He walked long distances, slept in improvised places, and he said he knew the cemeteries in the region like few others. Just imagine. It turns out that all of this has an origin that Moskvin himself later explained in an article he wrote shortly before he was arrested, in fact. And this origin is the point where the story starts to become, if that's even possible, even more unusual. According to his account, in 1979, when he was 13 years old, he was coming back from school and was stopped by a group of men dressed in black. They were people on their way to the funeral of an 11-year-old girl. Several sources that tell this macabre story give the name of this girl as Natasha Petrova. Those men who were at the funeral, still according to Moskvin's account, dragged him to the little girl's coffin and forced him to kiss her. He kissed the face of the dead girl. He wrote that an adult pushed his head down against the girl's cold forehead and that he had no choice but to obey and kiss her. And he said that he kissed her once, then again, and then once more. And to top it off, still according to the version he published, the girl's mother supposedly put a ring on her finger and another on his finger, as if a wedding had taken place right there. But look, I need to emphasize here that this is what he himself wrote, okay? Decades later, to explain his own fixation. It's not a fact verified by others, but it's the justification he gave. And it helps at least to understand how his obsession with death was being built, doesn't it? Because from then on, he started wandering through cemeteries as a boy, and he never stopped. Well, so we have this character, right, that I just briefly introduced. The reclusive scholar, the greatest cemetery expert in the city. Now the question is, how did the police end up knocking on his door? And to answer that, we need to go back a little in time, okay? To before that opening scene at his house with the dolls. Because the story didn't start in that house, it actually started in the cemeteries. Around 2009, the residents of his city started reporting that their relatives' graves had been violated. It wasn't an isolated case, okay? There was actually a wave of cases there. Someone was going around opening graves, disturbing burials, and taking objects. Even the little metal plaques, you know, the ones that stay on top of the graves with the names, all of them were being taken from the tombstones. And the most disturbing detail of this whole thing, in some cases, the grave had simply been emptied. In other words, the body was no longer there. The police, of course, opened an investigation. But the first interpretation they made of the case sent everyone in the wrong direction. And this is where the real investigation begins, okay? The Russian Ministry of the Interior looked at that pattern of desecrated graves and came up with a hypothesis. This is the work of some extremist group. A spokesperson even explained to the press that they had reinforced the teams and assembled groups with the most experienced detectives specializing in extremist crimes to closely investigate this case. And this lead gained strength for a concrete reason. Among the desecrated graves, there were Muslim tombs. This made the investigation treat part of the crimes as a possible hate crime motivated by religion. And this initial context, without knowing the whole background, made sense, right? Graves from a specific community being attacked, the logic points to persecution. But 2 years of investigation along those lines didn't lead anywhere. 2 years. The detectives specialized in extremism dug both literally and figuratively, I'd say, and didn't find any organization at all. Behind it, no cell, no political motivation, nothing. That's because there simply wasn't any. The whole premise was wrong. It wasn't a group, it was a dark, determined one-man army. In January 2011, there was an attack at Domodedovo airport over in Moscow. The Russian authorities went on alert, and that context of desecrated Muslim graves heightened the sensitivity around any possible religious tension. The investigators then started to pay closer attention to these cemeteries. There were details that didn't match the profile of a typical attack. In some cases, someone would tamper with very specific elements of the graves without destroying the surroundings, you know? What was around them? It didn't seem like just an angry retaliation because of the attack. It was too specific and it kept happening. And as the extremist group theory started to lose ground because they couldn't link it to anything, one thing became increasingly clear. Whoever was doing that knew those cemeteries very well. It wasn't someone acting on impulse, really wanting retaliation. It was someone who knew how to move around there, knew where to look, knew what to search for, and above all was way too familiar with that world. That's when a name came up, right? Actually, the name started to become almost impossible to ignore.
Anatoly Moskvin.
He wasn't unknown in that circle, obviously. On the contrary, he was the guy who had been studying cemeteries for years, writing about it, knew graves, maps, tombstones, stories of the dead, and funeral rituals like almost no one else in the region. Up until that moment, that made him a specialist. But for the investigators, it could also make him someone with too much opportunity, knowledge, and familiarity with those places, right? That's how, in November 2011, the investigation led investigators to the apartment where Moskvin lived and to a garage linked to him. The police went in there, looking for evidence about the grave desecrations, but what they found was much worse than a collection of stolen tombstone plaques. Okay? Not just some petty thief. They found the doll collection I mentioned to you, which in fact were bodies. And look, there's even some irony in all of this, isn't there? Because Moskvin was actually one of the most well-known people in the region when it came to cemeteries. So at first, he must have even been seen more as a source of information than as a suspect. It was only after things started to narrow down that he became involved in this, which led to that visit to his house. But until then, for a long time, the guy was maybe more of a consultant to the police than a suspect. Go figure. It's practically that old saying, isn't it? The more obvious it is, the more hidden it is. Well, but finding the bodies was just the beginning of the work, because now they had 26 bodies there in that apartment. And the hard part would be reconstructing what had happened to each of them, where each body came from, how many graves in total he had opened, and how long that had been going on right under everyone's nose. And it was during this reconstruction, let's say, that the scale of the case exploded. Searching Moskvin's apartment, the police didn't just find the bodies. They also found metal plaques torn from tombstones, instructions on how to make dolls, and maps of the local cemeteries in the area. They also found some shoes there whose soles matched the footprints they had already found in some desecrated cemeteries. And they also found a collection of photos and videos showing open graves and bodies being taken out of the ground. Putting all this together, the investigators estimated that Moskvin could have violated around 150 graves. The 26 bodies found in the apartment and garage were just the ones he had taken home, in other words, turned into dolls. The rest of the count was never fully settled, okay? Because a large part of that material couldn't be conclusively linked to a specific body. The investigation pointed to cemeteries in his city and also in the surrounding region. It even mentioned a cemetery in Moscow and another in the Moscow area. In other words, the guy was operating within a pretty wide radius. And after that discovery, we can say Moskvin cooperated with the investigators. He didn't deny anything, he didn't make up an alibi. According to him, that had been happening for years. In some reports, about 10 years, the hardest part of the investigation came afterwards, okay? which was to identify one by one who those little girls were. One of the victims was recognized as Olga Shardimova, a 10-year-old child. The head of the investigation committee for that region classified the case as exceptional, with no parallel in the country's modern forensics. And there was even more reason for all this astonishment. The man didn't live alone. His parents shared the apartment with him. They knew about the dolls and even had one in their own room. But according to the investigation, they never thought, right? It never crossed their minds that those were children. And there's more detail about the parents, okay? According to press reports, they weren't always in the apartment, and that might have helped Moskvin, to keep that collection away from real suspicion for so long, okay? And there are even some reports that say he didn't always take them straight home. He had some places near the cemeteries where he stored them, did a kind of curing process there, you know? Drying them out with salt, with baking soda and so on. Most likely, right? I assume he sometimes did this and took them there as if they were dolls. Man, it's surreal, isn't it? What did he want? Well, in this investigation, we've just figured out how this happened. But there's still one question left. Why? Why would a man do that? And the answer that Moskvin himself gave is, in a way that's even scary, consistent with everything that came before, okay? He said he felt enormous pity for those dead children and that he truly believed he could bring them back to life, whether it was through science or through magic. Remember, he was a specialist in Celtic culture. In other words, he had learned that the ancient Druids used to sleep on tombs to communicate with dead spirits. He also studied the peoples of Siberia, especially the ancient Yakuts, and discovered that they had similar practices. So he developed his own method based on all of that. He looked for obituaries of children who had just died, and when the obituary spoke to him, according to him, he would go to that child's grave and sleep on top of it, to feel if the spirit wanted to come back or not. He claimed that at first he would never open a grave without the permission of the child who was inside. Over time, sleeping on the cold cemetery ground became physically difficult for him. That's when he started taking the bodies home. According to his logic, they would be more comfortable, warmer, and the spirits would be more willing to talk inside a welcoming home than underground. The dolls, then, in his mind, were obviously usable bodies waiting for the day when he would finally figure out how to bring them back to life. And there's another layer to this, okay? Moskvin wanted to be a father. He especially wanted a daughter. He even tried to adopt a girl, but his request was denied by the authorities due to insufficient income. And here it even seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Because despite all of Moskvin's academic prestige, he earned little. He was a freelance journalist, did commissioned work, taught at a public university, but everything was poorly paid in the context of Russia at that time. He lived with his elderly parents because he depended on them financially. For the adoption agency, then, academic prestige wasn't enough. And there was another complication. His own parents were against this adoption. Why? That's a question that stayed in my mind. Well, and here we also need to be careful because, as you can imagine, guys, the press labeled the case in many ways. An outside psychiatrist, based on what was heard at the time, speculated that his condition could involve necrophilia, but Moskvin himself denied this. The court recognized a different official diagnosis, okay? Paranoid schizophrenia. Still on this topic, when the investigators asked him directly if there was any sexual component to all of this, he denied it, okay? He insisted that he saw them as daughters. But the part that outraged the families the most was his apparent indifference. There was no apology, no display of shame, nothing like that. In Moskvin's mind, apparently, he thought he was right in what he was doing. He had a reason. This became clear when the girl's parents confronted Moskvin. And he didn't back down. Not only did he not back down, but he turned the tables on the girl's parents. He said essentially that they were the ones who abandoned their own daughters in the cold and that he was the one who took them home and warmed them up. In his mind, he hadn't committed any crime. He had performed a rescue and it didn't stop there. He warned the authorities not to bury the girls again, threatening that on the day he was released, he would dig them up once more. Yeah, guys, that's really heavy, isn't it? But then, in the face of all this morbid, unusual, macabre discovery, what happened to this guy? It's just that the case stops being just a horror story from the past and becomes an issue that's still open to this day, okay? Moskvin was charged under Article 244 of the Russian Penal Code, which deals with the desecration of graves and bodies. Even in its most serious forms, it was a crime whose maximum sentence was far below the horror that the families felt in the face of all this. There was also an initial charge related to the desecration of Muslim graves, which was treated as a hate crime or extremism. But as the investigation progressed, that hypothesis no longer explained the heart of the case. What the police found did not point to an organized cell or a clear political motivation, but rather to Moskvin's individual obsession, as we've seen. But the regular trial never happened. After his psychiatric evaluation, which indicated paranoid schizophrenia, on May 25, 2012, the court declared Moskvin unfit to stand trial. Instead of prison, he was sentenced to compulsory medical treatment and admitted to a psychiatric clinic. The prosecution was satisfied with the decision and did not even appeal. And since then, it's been a recurring story, okay? Because his hospitalization has to be reviewed from time to time. And with each review, the treatment keeps getting extended. In 2013, 2014, and 2015, a spokesperson summed up the position at the time by saying that after years of monitoring Moskvin, it was clear that he was not fit to stand trial and that he would remain hospitalized. In September 2018, the hospital doctors declared that he was no longer dangerous and asked the court to release him for outpatient treatment at home. The reaction was one of horror, especially among the victims' relatives, and in February 2019, a new evaluation concluded that it was too soon to release Moskvin. The hospital itself ended up withdrawing the request. In 2025, information started circulating again about a possible change in his treatment regime. There was discussion about him possibly leaving the psychiatric hospital for family care. But the court stated that it had not received any medical documents authorizing his release. After that, in December 2025, the court in his city, Nizhny Novgorod, extended his compulsory treatment for another 6 months. In other words, according to the most recent information, Moskvin remains hospitalized with his situation scheduled for another review now in mid-June 2026. For the families, this possibility of release continues to be terrifying. They remember that he never showed any real remorse and even said that if he were released, he would dig up the girls again. And here, going back a little in time to 2016, just look at how unusual the context around this man is. As I said, back in 2016, it was reported that Moskvin planned to marry a 25-year-old woman who had attended his hearings. But I need to say that this is one of those side pieces of information about the case, okay? So it's worth treating it as a media report, not as a proven central fact. But I don't know, right? What is actually known is that Anatoly Moskvin, as of the end of this episode, is still committed to the Russian psychiatric hospital. Over the years, some medical evaluations and discussions have indicated stability in his condition and the possibility of less restrictive treatment. According to clinical logic, compulsory hospitalization should not be perpetual, and he has a diagnosis of mental illness, not a prison sentence. But then if he's fit to be released, he could be tried now, right? I don't know. And Russian law, like the law in most countries, provides for reintegration when the patient is considered stable, okay? On the other side are the families, the mothers who had their daughters taken from their own graves, who remember his words accusing the family of abandoning the girls in the cold. Think about the magnitude of that, guys. These families lost their daughters, very young, practically children. Then the guy goes there and desecrates the graves. It's the kind of thing that touches that dirty sewage water at the bottom of your soul, isn't it? For that reason, obviously, for all the family members and anyone with common sense, letting this man back in is a risk, isn't it? And here's the question that Russian justice needs to answer from time to time, and that I actually want to leave for you who's watching me. Does it make sense for a man with this history to return to living in society, even under medical supervision, family oversight, and all the requirements the state can impose? Or for him, should the door remain closed? Tell me in the comments what you think about this. And don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel for more real cases like this. Every week, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, there are new episodes, and if possible, become a member here to support these creations. Deal? I really appreciate your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.